Emily, are you ready?
Ready.
Thank you very much, and we welcome you to our Touchpoints expert speaker presentation. And our Touchpoints topic for 7th grade, as you know, is infectious diseases, and preparing you for a debate on how polio, the eradication of polio, is a model for eradicating other diseases like HIV, AIDS, and malaria. And so we are very fortunate today to have an expert speaker that has studied many years on this topic. And I'm going to ask our science teacher, Mr. Josh Davendonis, to introduce our speaker. Mr. Davendonis.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. I just want to say thank you for coming quickly. I had the privilege of meeting our guest speaker, Dr. Marion Fass, when I was a student in her class in 2006. That's when I was a freshman in Beloit College in her human biology class. And you can ask her at the end of this presentation if I was a good student or not. I like to think that I was. Dr. Fass has been studying this for a long time. It's one of her favorite topics. Her classes at Beloit have been global health, microbiology, human biology, emerging diseases. So she is indeed an expert on this, and she's going to show you some pretty fun stuff like we've been talking about in class, some gross things, some cool things. We'll have some time for questions at the end, but go ahead and help me in welcoming to North Broward, Dr. Marion Fass.
This is really fun to be here, and I always really like to talk about gross diseases. One of the neat things about being a microbiologist is you get to talk about gross diseases all the time. So please excuse me if we get gross and have some icky pictures along the way. These are not the really icky ones yet. But I want you to think about infectious diseases really from the perspective of the germs instead of from the perspective of people who get sick. And I want you to recognize that infectious diseases are really other species trying to find a place, a niche, where they can have a home, have food, be protected, reproduce, and spread their offspring out to new homes, okay? And they just happen to use us along the way. And we can think about these germs, and germs is kind of a really awkward term because really we're talking about pathogenic bacteria and viruses and protists and pathogenic worms. And so pathogenic is a word that means causing disease. And you know about some of these, and I know you've talked about them in your classes. You've got bacteria that cause things like strep throat, protists, the plasmodium that cause malaria, pathogenic worms, that's really gross, we talk about those, and viruses, which are non-cellular obligate parasites, and they cause things like colds and flu and HIV AIDS. But I want you to think also about how we are exposed to these things. First, remember, there are lots of good bacteria out there, and recently microbiologists have been talking more and more about the good bacteria. It turns out that we have 10 times more bacterial cells in our body than we have human cells, so we really are mostly bacteria and a few human cells in there. This is a great picture. I wish it were better focused. A whole bunch of the bacteria in our guts. There are lots of different species. They're really important in how we digest food. They have an ecology in there that some of them make chemicals that the other ones use. They're really quite imbalanced. If you've ever taken an antibiotic pill and gotten a stomachache or diarrhea, that was because the bacteria in your gut got knocked out as well and you got a little sick. They got off balance, the ecology shifted. So most of our bacteria we live happily with, but there's some that are pathogens that use us for ways of spreading. And so think about the ways that people get exposed to disease. And so you can think about them. And they're all up there, so I can't ask you to contribute. But right, there's sneezing and coughing. There's picking up germs from inanimate objects. Your mom tells you, don't touch this, it's dirty. There's a great word, it's fomite. Okay, you might want to remember that and go home and say, oh, I don't want to touch that computer keyboard, it's a fomite. That just means it's an inanimate object that carries germs. People get disease sometimes from drinking dirty water. Sometimes that water is contaminated with feces. It's kind of yucky. Mosquitoes, other insects are vectors of disease. And here we're a little scared, I think, in South Florida. There's recently been a new disease introduced into this part of the world. It's spread by mosquitoes. It's called dengue. Anybody heard of dengue? Yeah, there was an outbreak of dengue in Key West, and there have recently been some cases further north up here. So I worry about dengue because those mosquitoes don't know who to bite. And then there's the probability of diseases being spread by direct bloodborne transmission. People get infected in hospitals. They get infected by shooting drugs. What better way to get an infection than to have somebody put it directly in your bloodstream? And then people get infected through sexual transmission, and you've heard about that with diseases like HIV and sexually transmitted infections. So I think that these methods of the way the disease is spread are one of the ways of thinking about can we eradicate and control different diseases. So some of you have talked about smallpox. That's the disease up there. You may have talked a little bit about polio. I know that's where the classes are going. The good news about smallpox is you don't have to worry about it anymore. Smallpox was eradicated in 1980. There are no longer any smallpox virus around. And in fact, people my age got vaccinated for it because it was still around when I was a kid. But people your age don't, because there is no smallpox. But I want to talk about how it was eradicated a little bit. Polio is still around, and this little boy has polio. He's had paralysis of his legs. Polio's controlled, but it's reemerged in some places, tends to reemerge where there are wars. And so I want you to realize that diseases and politics can really connect a lot. We don't think about it. You think, okay, I have disease, you have disease, but politics is really important. And there are major efforts going on to control lots of other diseases like malaria. One of the leaders in that is Bill Gates. Who knows who Bill Gates is? Somebody tell me who Bill Gates is. Yes. Yeah, you got.
He's the one who started Microsoft.
Right, he started Microsoft. He's turned out to be a real good guy because he's invested his fortune in global health problems. Yeah?
He's also one of the richest people in the world.
Right, he's also one of the richest people in the world, and so it's nice to know that somebody who's incredibly rich is trying very hard to focus on disease eradication. So as I told you, smallpox was eradicated in 1980. That means there are no more cases. But most of the story has to do with what this guy looks like. Because obviously nobody wants to look like that, right? Smallpox was spread airborne. It was spread by coughing and sneezing. Had a high mortality rate. 1 in 4 people who were infected with smallpox actually died. The good news about it was that people who were most contagious when they had visible pox. So if I walked into this room with looking like that, what would you do?
Run.
Yeah, right. And that would be really wise. Or the other thing you might have done would have been asked somebody to give you a vaccine, because the vaccine worked after you've been exposed. So that was other really good news. Another thing is that smallpox is caused by a DNA virus that doesn't mutate. So it doesn't change in ways that the vaccine would stop working. It's always the same. What we know from many diseases is that exposure causes immunity. If you're exposed to some diseases, you're not going to get it when you're infected again, although lots of diseases have figured out ways, lots of pathogens have figured out ways to evade that. Recognizing that people didn't want their kids to be ugly. Women with scars like that were not marriageable. You know, you wouldn't want your daughter to have smallpox scars, right? So in Asia before 1700, people were deliberately exposed, children were deliberately exposed to the pus from those scabs. They would take the pus and they'd make a little scratch on their leg or on their buttocks and infect them. And about 1 in 100 would die, but the rest of them wouldn't get smallpox. So that was really great. Some European diplomats came around at that time, and they saw that the Asian people, and the Turks and people like that, had ways of protecting. So they brought that back to Europe and then to the United States. And Dr. Edward Jenner in 1792 noticed that milkmaids who took care of cows and got cowpox, a kind of mild disease, also were protected against smallpox. So he did some experiments, and he learned that being infected with cowpox protects people from smallpox, and that was the beginning of vaccination, and it took off. In developed countries, people adapted this quickly. They wanted to protect their children, their families, and that's a blurry picture of a kid getting scratched with the cowpox scabs to protect against this disease. You may have read in history books that some of the great advantages that troops from Europe had, soldiers from Europe had in invading countries in Central and South America was they exposed them to smallpox for the first time. And they won the wars because so many people died and so many people were afraid. But the vaccine was developed in 1792, but eradication didn't happen until 1980. So when you think about eradication, think about the challenges that countries face in eradicating, or that the world faces. I love that. If you look carefully, that's a poster of a guy with spots. You see it? And if we're bigger, you'd see that it was in lots of languages. It was, you get $1,000 if you identify somebody who's got a case. Because what happened was the global program decided first to vaccinate everybody in the world, and that was really hard to do. They couldn't do it. The second thing was, let's find cases of smallpox, surround those people who have ugly scabs, vaccinate all their friends and family, and try to eradicate cases one by one. At the end, they worried a lot about mass gatherings of people. One was the Hajj, when Muslims go to Mecca and then go back home. You could think about it with the World Cup, when people come from around the world. What if somebody got infected and took it home? But so eventually they eradicated every single case, and these guys were real heroes. So here's just a list of some of the vaccine-preventable diseases right now. You guys, as little kids, got a shot from measles, mumps, and rubella. It's called an MMR. You've probably been vaccinated for chickenpox, for hepatitis B, human papillomavirus, people are talking about a lot these days. We've got a flu shot that people get each year, and you've all had polio vaccines, and that's really important. But there are lots of diseases out there that we don't have vaccines for yet, HIV and malaria and dengue and Chagas disease and many more. So now I'm going to talk to you about guinea worm, because that's really gross. That is truly a worm coming out of that person's leg. Guinea worm, but this is a really, wait. This is gross, but this is a really great story, okay? In 1986, there were 3.5 million cases of this disease around the world. Obviously, you would not want to have it. And that number has been reduced by 99.9%. Not with drugs, and not with pills, and not with vaccines, but I'm going to tell you how. And U.S. President Jimmy Carter really led the battle. The next picture is more gross, okay? All right, so I'm going to tell you about, let's go to this. Okay, I told you one of the cool things about being a microbiologist is you can be really gross sometimes. So it turns out that the question is, how can you eradicate that disease? It's caused by these worms. They live in drinking water. They affect people in very poor countries where they don't have water out of the taps, and they get water out of ponds. And I want you to think about how one would eradicate it. So when the worm comes out, you can't break it off because then you get infected. What they do is they take a little twig or a pencil, and they roll the worm up, and it takes about a month for it to emerge. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about the life cycle, and then we're going to have a quiz. No, but I want you, as we go through the life cycle, I want you to think about how you could help people eradicate this disease. Yeah, do you have a question up there?
Yeah. Does the worm grow in your body?
Yeah, the worm, yeah, it does. No, it doesn't kill you, it just makes you really unhappy. It hurts a lot.
Because there's a worm in your body.
Well, but there are lots of worm diseases out there. We generally don't get them in the United States, but there are diseases like schistosomiasis and really long, weird name diseases, lymphatic filariasis, where people do get worms either through their food or through swimming in contaminated water or by drinking dirty water. We're just very lucky that with our sanitation, we've eliminated risk. Yeah.
That last picture you showed us, the
Yeah.
guy who had in the shop.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
The guy who kind of had his foot
Yeah, the big blister with the worm coming out of it.
Yeah, there was no left the worm.
No, the worm didn't eat the bone. It was just a big blister. And so I want you to think about this way. I know this is gross. I want you to think about it from the perspective of the worm. Okay? Right. So the worm wants a way to find a home where it can reproduce and have access to good food. It likes blood. It wants to be able to grow in a protected place, like your body. And then it needs a way to get out and to spread its children around. Okay? So if you look at this picture, which is from the Centers for Disease Control, a human drinks water that has these little shrimpy-like things, copepods in it. And they have the parasite, the baby worms inside them. And when the person drinks the water, the copepods die, the worms survive, and they grow, and they move from the intestines into the bloodstream, and the female worm gets really long, about this long. The male worm's just about that long, but they mate, and the larvae develop within the female. What the female worm does is she migrates out to the person's leg. That causes or the arm. It causes a blister to appear, and it's painful. And the worm sort of tries to get out. And what the person does is they stick their foot or their arm in a cool body of water, a pond, and that causes the female to release her larva into the water. So here's this interesting sort of adaptation. So you put your arm in the water, the larvae escape, and the water gets contaminated. The larvae swim around to the copepods, they become infected in the copepods, and that cycle continues. Now, it doesn't happen when we turn on our tap water because our tap water has been filtered and chlorinated. But it happens in places where people don't have good tap water. So I want you to think about strategies that you would use if you were a scientist trying to stop the spread of this disease. Yeah?
Is it originally like microscopic, like you can't see it in the water?
You can't, the copepods you might be able to see, they're not microscopic, but people don't have access to other clean water without these things in it. Yeah?
Well, if people go to another body of water where they won't drink the water there.
Right, they might want to find another body of water that's not infected. Yeah?
When the female worm goes to the arm and to the leg, and she lets out the larva in the water, the female worms stay in his leg.
Oh yeah, those are the ones that keep coming out. And then if you put your leg in the water again, she lays more eggs. Okay, so there's really good news here. I told you, this is a disease that is almost eradicated, okay? The cases have gone from 3.5 million to 500. So 3.5 million in 1986 to 500 this year. So you can't cut off the worm because it causes bad infections. And here's a guy, a volunteer, educating some people in the community about what they should do. And what they tell them to do is filter your water, and they give people an inexpensive way to filter their water. So they're still drinking the same water from the pond, but they filtered it so that the copepods aren't there anymore, and they don't get the water in the pond where we drink our water from. And so they give them a bucket. Say if you need to put your arm somewhere, put it in this bucket. Don't contaminate the water source. So this has been tremendously successful, except the remaining cases are in South Sudan. And if you've been following the news lately, there's a civil war emerging in South Sudan, and sometimes it's very hard to get disease control, people controlling diseases into a war zone. So that's a problem. All right, so we haven't yet eradicated polio or malaria or influenza, but I want you to think about the life cycle of these diseases in comparison to the two diseases we've talked about, in comparison to guinea worm and polio, and sort of think, well, what do we need to know about a disease to eradicate it? So what questions would you like to know? Yes?
There have been many diseases where they've been eradicated, where they use dead versions of diseases and experiment on the body with notes to look for these in order to eradicate them. But how scientists have any of these, so these diseases have mutated in a way that they cannot get the dead cells fast enough, so body can look out for more of these?
Not sure I understand, but let me try to come back to it. Okay. What?
Never mind.
He's talking about when a disease like the influenza mutates and he can't get vaccination fast enough.
Right. So influenza mutates really fast because of the way that its genetic code is. These diseases that we've seen eradicated don't mutate very fast. So that's a good point, is that if we've got diseases that don't mutate, they're more likely to be controlled. If diseases are really ugly, gross, and disfiguring, and you can recognize people who are infected, that's a good thing. I mean, it's a good thing for eradication, right? If you remember about smallpox, if somebody is contagious when they're ugly, that's a good thing. You need to think about how the disease spreads, right? Is there a treatment? Is there a vaccine? And does the germ make it harder to mutate? In my classes, we talk about diarrhea all the time. So you know people, because diarrhea is important. But diarrhea is really important when you talk about polio. So I don't know if you guys would ever know anybody with polio. My uncle had polio. He got it, he was really old. He got it in 1918. He always looked to me like a man who was 6 feet tall, but he only grew to be 5'7", because his legs were so shrunken by the polio. And I asked my father one time why he'd become a doctor, and he said he became a doctor because he lived through his older brother's polio experience, and that was so motivating to help people. So polio causes paralysis in about 15% of the cases. It's spread by virus in the feces. If it contaminates the water, it hangs out in there. Sometimes we talk about the fecal-oral route, which is why your moms and dads tell you to wash your hands all the time, because you don't want to be contaminated with changing somebody's diaper and touching your mouth or whatever. Okay? There are no animal cases for polio. It only affects humans. But here's the kicker. People are infectious before they show symptoms. So you can't rush in where the guy had smallpox and stop it. People are infectious when you don't know it. There's no treatment for people once they're infected, but it can be prevented with a vaccine. And in the U.S., vaccination of almost all children and having clean water really have controlled polio in this country. But polio persists in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nigeria and Syria, places where there's a lot of political unrest. There have been some stories of vaccination being a way that one side of a war is trying to kill or make the other side of the war infertile, so is this used as a political weapon? And there's just recently been an outbreak in Syria of polio cases because regular medical care for little kids was disrupted by the war. And so children under 2 haven't had vaccines, and they were exposed to the polio virus and infected. All right, how am I doing? Should I keep talking? I have maybe 3 more slides. I want to talk to you about malaria. So if you've traveled to parts of South America or Africa, you've probably had medicine for malaria, but you can't give it to everybody out there. This map shows you the places where malaria cases are most serious using the most available data from the World Health Organization. Those places that are dark red and orange have the highest number of cases. The brown, is probably Chad. I've been here to Kenya and Tanzania. Took malaria pills so I wouldn't get it. But we've pretty much eliminated malaria in the United States in 2 ways. We controlled the population of mosquitoes, and we reduced the number of people who had malaria in their bodies. Malaria has a really complex life cycle. It's caused by a protozoan parasite. It lives both in the human body and it goes through a whole bunch of reproductive stages. It goes through a whole nother set of reproductive stages in the mosquito. There's some really scary facts about malaria in terms of its eradication. Number 1 is it occurs in birds, bats, monkeys, and all sorts of other animals, so that even if we were to eradicate malaria in humans, we'd still have a reservoir of it in those other animals, and maybe it could jump back. The malaria parasite mutates and evolves, like that question that was asked. And so, although we've had a lot of drugs that treat malaria, the parasite is resistant to those drugs. And similarly, people have tried to control malaria by getting rid of mosquitoes. In the 1970s, the idea was, let's just get rid of all the mosquitoes in the world, and then we won't have any malaria. Any problems with that? No. Yeah, they serve some good roles, right? I don't know.
They're so small, you never know.
Could we get rid of them all? Something else would evolve in there. Anyway, but the mosquitoes became resistant to the insecticide, and so now we've got super strong mosquitoes out there. So let me sort of end with this idea of what are scientists doing right now to eradicate malaria. And the Gates Foundation is putting a lot of money into research, as is the foundation funded by the Mayor Bloomberg of New York City. They're investigating the life cycle of the Plasmodium, just like we looked at the life cycle of the guinea worm. They want to know all about its stages and the proteins it expresses on the outside of this parasite so they can develop targets for drugs. They're working to develop these new drugs using the best of biochemistry that they can come up with. And similarly, they're trying to make a vaccine. The vaccine would target, there's some ideas of a vaccine that would target the humans, maybe vaccines that would target some kinds of ways of making the mosquitoes uninfectable. They're studying the behavior of people and mosquitoes. For the most part, these are mosquitoes that bite at night. Bed nets usually work really effectively to protect people in places where people don't have screens on their windows, and so that's a mother and her baby under the mosquito net. When I slept under a mosquito net in Tanzania, I tried not to be freaked out and just to pretend that I was a fairy princess. You know, it was weird. But because it looked like those sort of nets that you see in fairy tales. But I think the other things that the research are doing right now is identifying the scientific challenges for you all, who will be the scientists of the future, to study to eradicate these diseases. And so a lot of it's biochemical, a lot of it's chemical, and some of it is understanding human behavior. So here's what I want you to remember, is that diseases are controlled by breaking the cycle of infection, not just really by just giving people pills. So the vaccine does that, blocking the contact between pathogens and hosts, and sanitation. Clean water, having toilets are really important in developing countries where these diseases are still problems. And eradication is very difficult, control is achievable. You need to do case finding, just like that poster from the smallpox outbreak. Especially in war. Wars kill people, but wars also create the conditions for the spread of diseases. And public health measures like vaccinating children, controlling mosquitoes, and assuring clean water are really important. So if you were my college students, I keep talking about this for a whole semester, but that's about all I'm going to say. So thank you.